Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, I'm going to show textured element number 6. It's a technique that I use for adding texture to my slow stitching pieces. Now there are 5 other techniques and I'll link each video down below in case you want to take a look at them. But this technique uses the mermaid scales, and it's kind of a fun technique, and I show 2 ways to achieve this. You can achieve it just with stitches, making them look like mermaid scales overlapped, or fish scales, I guess, or roof tiles even if you'd like. And then I show another way where you cut out fabric pieces and stitch those on in the same fashion. It's a little more work. It is easier to do with larger pieces of fabrics or scales rather than the small ones because it can get tedious. But the result is overwhelmingly beautiful. And in certain situations, it adds a really nice textured layer to your piece. Now here's my process. So for textured element number 6, we're going to do these mermaid scales here. They're kind of a fun element where you can layer fabric together to get the scales and then enhance them with stitches. And also you can just do it without the fabric element and just the stitches. So that's kind of fun. Now for my reference tag, I'm going to do it in both ways. This way I can refer back to it when I want something to add to my slow stitching piece, but I'm not quite sure what. So I'm just going to take my Frixion pen here, it's a marker pen, and on the top half I'm just going to draw those mermaid scales. So I just kind of make my U's. They don't have to be perfect. And then the next layer I come down combining the U's. Now this is one way to do them where I kind of overlap the scales. For this one, for my fabric one, I'm not going to overlap them. I'll do one more row here of scales because I like the way that looks. The more scales, the more intriguing it is. But for the fabric ones, I'm just going to cut the fabric scraps, and I'm going to use 3 pieces of fabric here, 3 different patterns or colors. And I just want to create a bunch of scraps that I can then overlay. And so I'll create just a little strip with all my fabric here. I'll move this to the side. And then I'll create my fabric scraps. Now ideally I want them to be approximately the same size, but they don't have to be. Again, you make this what works for you and you fine-tune it accordingly. So I have my scraps here. I like to cut 3 at a time, and I just kind of play with it. So those are approximately the same size. I'll cut a few more. Then I have my scales right here. And I can take these scales and arrange them the way I want on my piece to give me those mermaid scale appearance. I can always cut more if I need to. So I'll just set aside my fabric scraps. And first I want to do my stitching here. I'm going to start at the top row. I'm going to use this yellow thread. You can use any type of stitch you want. I'm going to start here, and I'm just going to do a split stitch, which means I make a stitch, whatever length I want, and for curves, the smaller stitches are better because then you can make a nice tight curve. So I pull my thread, snug but not too tight, and then I want to come up here in the area right through the thread that I stitched, dividing it in half or so. And then I just create another stitch the same length as that first one that we made. And I continue this, following those lines, coming up through each of the stitches that I made. And I take this very calmly and slowly, and I get a beautiful result. It splits the stitch, so it makes it a little wider than it was originally, and it kind of weaves it. And it kind of weaves a pattern inside each stitch, which is very effective and very beautiful in itself. Now once I get to the top of this tile, I'm going to come down in the center of my next one, And I'm going to go towards the left, doing that same stitch until it joins up with our first stitch. So I made my stitch, coming up through it, and continuing until I meet up with the stitches I've already put down. Again, each time dividing the stitch, going through it, and again, I'm purposely making small stitches here because I have that little angle. I'll do one more to finish this off here. And then I'm going to come down here to where we started this particular tile, just right inside it. And now I'm going to go up to the top of the next tile, making my stitch, splitting it, and then continuing up that tile. Continue dividing it in half as I go up. Now I'll go to the next one and I'll do the same procedure. I'll start here and stitch up to meet it. Now I'm going a little off my sketch because I realized my sketch was kind of tilting to the right on an incline, and I just want to work that out. And now where it meets up with that tile, I'll come over here, the base of that stitch again, and build up the other side. And I'll show you what this looks like when I'm done. So now I completed stitching my mermaid stitch here using that split stitch, and I have a really interesting pattern. It's almost like a netting. I can always turn it on its side and you can see where they think it looks like fish scales or mermaid scales. This is just a reference for me. It goes on my tags here with all my other reference images of the different tags I've made with different texture. So this way I can refer back to it when I want to add texture to one of my slow stitching pieces, but I'm not really quite sure what to add. So here I have the mermaid stitch, but now I want to incorporate fabric collage into that. So I have those scales that I cut out, and now I'll build up those scales. I'm going to do it a little differently. Instead of alternating, I'm just going to do it right on top of each other. And the way I do this is I build up from the bottom up. So I'll take my first row and I'll set it down, and I'm just alternating here the different patterns and colors here, the blue, kind of an aqua blue, and that yellow, and that pattern. And I'll just play around with it until I have it set down. And then I'm just going to stitch around each one of these. And I could play around further to make them all line up a little bit better. And I'm just going to take some thread and stitch around all of them. So I'll start by just pinning each one down. So I've pinned each one down and I just lined them up at the bottom. And now it doesn't really matter which side you start from. I'm going to start from the right-hand side here. I'm just going to start at the top, and I am going to overlap right at the top, so I don't have to get it quite to the tip top on this one. And I'm going to pull my stitches and just stitch right down and around each individual tile. I'm just going to use a small stitch, skip a little space, and do another small stitch, and I'll continue this all the way around each one of these little tiles here, as I call them, each one of these mermaid scales. The small stitches help making that rounded edge so it curves nicely around the base of this tile, and the stitches also emphasize each of the tiles, so that's a very interesting look. I'm using contrasting thread, but if you wanted to, you can use the same color thread as your fabric. I just happen to like the look of this color, as well as the little stitches showing. I think it looks just handmade. So there's one tile stitched down. I can remove that pin, and you can see how it's coming along. I'll stitch around the remaining tiles and show you how it looks when that one row is completed, and then I'll show you my process for adding the next few rows. So I've finished stitching my first row of tiles. Now if I was to stitch it in the same formation as above here, I would take these and alternate them, going so that the tile on top is on one half of one tile and one half of the other. But because I want a variation for reference, I'm just going to put my tile right on top of the existing row, just like this. And again, I'm not worrying so much about the top, I'm just lining up the bottom. And then I'll take my pins and stick them inside each one of these to hold them in place. I'm going to come up here with my needle again and stitch, continuing to stitch around the perimeter of the next row, right on the edge, just like I did on that first row. So I'll make these teeny little stitches. These are just straight stitches all the way around. When I come to the area where I've already stitched, because of that scale underneath, I'll just take my stitches and go gently. Remove my pin and continue to stitch as I go. And now I'll continue to do this on the remaining scales. Again, starting on one side and continuing to work my way around. So there I have 2 rows. I think I'm going to do one more row because I'd like to show that on my piece, just those multiple rows. So I'll complete that and we'll take one more look at our piece. So there we have our textured element, our mermaid scales. You can stitch your scales and you could stagger them and make them almost teardrop shaped, or you could stitch them and do them straight on, just like regular tiles, or you can swap them out and do them the inverse. I think it's a beautiful stitch and a beautiful shape, and I like to use this in my textile art. So I hope you found that video helpful, and you can think of different ways to add those mermaid scales to your slow stitching pieces. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for joining me today.